The silence that followed Carlisle's laughter wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, a thick, pressurized vacuum that made the oxygen in the room feel thin. In the sterile, fluorescent glare of the ore, every movement seemed to slow to a stuttering crawl. Hannah, the senior scrub nurse, kept her eyes glued to the instrument tray, her hands trembling so violently that the hemostats rattled against the stainless steel. She had seen Carlisle's temper before, but this was different. This was a dismissal of reality itself. Omar, the tall, usually stoic technician, shifted his weight near the back wall, his silhouette cast long against the tiled floor. He looked from the monitors to the back of Carlisle's arrogant, unmoving head, then to Zeal. He wanted to speak. The data on the screen was screaming what Zeal had just whispered, but the hierarchy of the hospital was a glass ceiling reinforced with steel. To side with a nurse against the chief of surgery was professional suicide. He remained a ghost, just like Zeal had tried to be. Carlisle's posture was the personification of ego. He leaned over the patient's exposed chest with a relaxed, almost bored slouch, the loose arrogance of a man who believed the laws of biology answered to his title. He adjusted the retractor with a flourish, his eyes crinkling in a smile that remained hidden behind his mask but was visible in the cruel set of his brow. He was waiting for Zeal to wither, to apologize, to sink back into the tile and disappear. But Zeal Coleman didn't blink. She stood like a statue carved from obsidian, her fingers still leveled at the shifting waveform on the monitor. She could feel the target, on her back, the one she had moved across the country to escape, beginning to glow. She had spent years in high-stakes research labs, where data was the only god, and here, in this quietest room, she was watching a man sacrifice a human life on the altar of his own vanity. The only sound was the rhythmic thud hiss of the ventilator, and the steady beep, beep, of the vitals. But to Zeal's trained ears, the interval between those beeps was narrowing by milliseconds. The bubbling, she had noticed moments ago, a tiny, frothy turbulence near the suture line, was no longer a suggestion, it was a prophecy. "Dr. Carlisle," Zeal said again. Her voice wasn't a plea this time. It was a cold, clinical blade. "The pressure is now 88/54. The graft is failing." The silence shattered. Chloe, the junior nurse near the door, let out a small, muffled gasp, her eyes wide with horror. She looked at the monitor, then at the chief, her face pale against her blue cap. The tension had reached its breaking point. The air in the room felt like it was charged with static electricity, the kind that precedes a lightning strike. Carlisle didn't laugh this time. He froze. The scalpel in his hand stayed poised over the patient's heart, a silver needle of potential disaster. He slowly turned his head toward Zeal, his eyes narrowing into slits of pure, concentrated venom. "One more word," he whispered, the threat vibrating through the room, "and you will be escorted out of this hospital in handcuffs. I am the chief. You are a pair of hands that hands me tools. Do not mistake your proximity to greatness for an education." The surgical team watched, paralyzed, as the two locked eyes, the titan of the hospital's empire against the nurse who knew too much. The heartbeat of the patient on the table was the only thing keeping the room from exploding. 5 minutes were up. The countdown to the flat line had reached 0. The monitor didn't scream at first, it whined. It was a thin, electronic protest that signaled the beginning of the end. To anyone else in the room, the 8450 reading on the digital display was a concern, but to Zeal, it was a death sentence written in glowing green ink. She had calculated this trajectory the moment she saw the first microscopic bloom of blood beneath the graft, a structural failure Carlisle had dismissed as routine seepage. Carlisle remained hunched over the patient, his hands moving with a frantic, jerky energy that betrayed his mounting panic. The loose posture from moments ago had vanished, replaced by a rigid, sweating desperation. He was no longer the arrogant king of the ore. He was a man trapped in a room with a truth he couldn't bully into silence. "More suction," Carlisle barked, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "Hannah, get in here with the Yankower. There's a minor leak. It's nothing." Just a loose suture. Hannah moved forward, her eyes darting to Zeal with a look of silent pleading. She could see the blood pooling in the chest cavity, a dark, pulsing well that shouldn't be there. The suction canister began to fill with a sickening, rhythmic slurp, the clear plastic tubing turning a deep, terrifying crimson. "It's not a loose suture, doctor," Zeal said. Her voice was a low, steady hum, the only calm thing in a room dissolving into chaos. She didn't move toward the table yet. She stayed at the monitor, her eyes tracking the plummeting mean arterial pressure. "The graft is dissecting. If you don't clamp the aorta in the next 90 seconds, the internal pressure will tear the remaining vessel like wet paper." "Shut up!" Carlisle screamed, the sound echoing off the sterile tiles. A bead of sweat rolled from his forehead, hanging precariously over the open wound. "I said shut up! Omar, call security! Get this woman out of my sight!" Omar didn't move. He stood by the wall, his hands gripped so tightly at his sides that his knuckles were white. He looked at the monitor. 76 of 42. The heart rate was climbing into the 140s, a desperate, fluttering attempt by the body to compensate for the fluid loss. The patient was bleeding out, into their own chest, and the man with the scalpel was still pretending it was a rainy day. The air in the room grew colder, the scent of copper and ozone thick enough to taste. Chloe, the junior nurse, had backed away toward the crash cart, her hand hovering over the defibrillator paddles. She knew what was coming. They all did. The 5 minutes to flatline wasn't a guess, it was a mathematical certainty. 60 seconds, Zeal whispered. She wasn't looking at Carlisle anymore. She was looking at the patient, a father of 3, a man who had trusted the chief to fix a broken valve. She felt the old, familiar fire of the researcher ignite in her gut, the part of her that didn't care about hierarchies or hospital boards or targets, on her back. That version of Zeal Coleman had saved lives in 3 different languages. She wasn't about to let this one slip away because of a man's bruised ego. The monitor's beep transformed. The steady rhythm broke, stuttering into a chaotic, erratic gallop. Beep 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 beep. "Pressure is 40 over systolic," Hannah cried out, her voice rising to a near shriek. "He's breaking down! Doctor, he's crashing!" Carlisle froze. His hands, once so sure of their own greatness, hovered over the bloody mess in the chest cavity, trembling. The viper had been defanged by his own incompetence. He looked at the blood-slicked graft, then at the monitor, his jaw hanging open behind his mask. He had run out of arrogance. He had run out of time. Then the sound came. The flat line. "Step aside, Stephen," Zeal said. She didn't wait for his permission. She stepped into the light of the surgical lamp, the timid nurse, dissolving as she moved. The room held its breath as she reached for the tray. The unbroken, high-pitched scream of the flatline acted like a physical blow, knocking the air out of the room. The transition from life to the void was instantaneous, a digital cliff that the patient had finally tumbled over. Dr. Carlisle didn't move. His gloved hands, slick with the dark evidence of his failure, hovered inches above the open chest cavity like 2 pale, frozen birds. The arrogance that had fueled his laughter only minutes ago had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell of a man who realized, too late, that he had driven a life into a brick wall. "He's flatlining!" Hannah's voice cracked, a jagged edge of panic slicing through the sterile air. She reached for the internal paddles, her movements frantic and uncoordinated. "Doctor, what do we do? Do we shock?" Carlisle didn't answer. He blinked rapidly, his eyes darting between the pooling blood and the flat green line on the monitor. The chief was gone. In his place was a man paralyzed by the sudden, crushing weight of a body count. He was staring at the graft, the one Zeal had warned him about, which had finally shredded under the pressure, turning the surgical field into a lake of crimson. "Stephen, get out of the way!" The voice didn't come from a nurse. It came from a commander. Zeal Coleman didn't shout, but the sheer, icy authority in her tone acted like a physical shove. She stepped forward, her shoulder brushing Carlisle's as she moved into the primary surgical slot. The timid slouch she had maintained for months vanished, replaced by a spine of tempered steel. Her hands, which had spent the morning handing over clamps, now reached for the primary forceps with a predatory grace. "I said move," Zeal repeated, her eyes locking onto Carlisle's for a split second. The target she had been hiding was now a spotlight. "You've done enough. If you want him to leave this room alive, you will step back and let me work." Carlisle recoiled as if he'd been slapped. He stumbled back, his blood-stained scrubs catching the light of the overhead lamps. You can't touch him. You're a nurse. This is assault. This is a salvage." Zeal cut him off, her fingers already deep in the chest cavity. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Her world had narrowed down to the vibrating, silent heart beneath her hands. "Hannah, stop the paddles. We don't shock a dry heart." "Omar, I need a 4-0 proline on a tapered needle and a double-armed Gore-Tex suture, now." "Chloe, bypass is failing. Crank the flow to 4 liters and give me another unit of warm blood on the rapid infuser." The team stood frozen for a heartbeat, caught between the paralyzed chief and the woman who was suddenly speaking the language of a master surgeon. It was Omar who broke first. He saw the way Zeal's hands moved. Not with the clumsy desperation of a nurse out of her depth, but with the terrifying, microscopic precision of a world-class specialist. He didn't ask questions. He didn't look at Carlisle. He simply handed her the needle driver. "Proline, 4-0. Omar whispered, his voice steadying. "Thank you," Zeal said, her focus absolute. She began to move with a viper-like speed that made the previous 5 minutes look like a slow-motion film. She wasn't just suturing, she was rebuilding. The nurse persona lay on the floor like a discarded mask. As she worked, the cold sterility of the room seemed to bend to her will. She found the tear in the aorta, the one Carlisle had claimed didn't exist, and pinned it with a single, perfect stitch. The laughter was long gone. In its place was the rhythmic, metallic clicking of instruments and the heavy, focused breathing of a team that had found its leader. Carlisle watched from the shadows, his face pale and sweating, realizing that the nobody he had mocked was currently performing a miracle he didn't even have the skill to describe. The transition was more than professional. It was a physical coup. As Dr. Carlisle stammered, his gloved hands hovering uselessly in the air like pale ghosts, Zeal stepped into the sterile field with the weight of a mountain. She didn't wait for him to yield. With a firm, unyielding shove of her shoulder, she displaced the chief of surgery, forcing him to stumble back toward the instrument carts. The clatter of a drop tray rang out like a starting pistol, but Zeal didn't flinch. "Get him a chair before he faints," Zeal commanded, her voice cutting through the haze of panic. "And get me the pledged head sutures. Now." The room remained suspended in a heartbeat of pure shock. Hannah, who had spent a decade following the hospital's rigid caste system, stared at Zeal as if she had just watched a statue come to life. Omar's hands shook as he reached for the requested tray, but his eyes were wide with a sudden, dawning realization. This wasn't the frantic grasping of a nurse playing hero, this was the viper-like precision of a master. Zeal's hands disappeared into the patient's chest, moving with a speed that defied the gravity of the situation. While Carlisle had fumbled with the frayed edges of the aorta, Zeal worked with a microscopic grace that seemed to ignore the blood still slicking the field. She wasn't just suturing, she was weaving a new life. "Bypass flow at 4.5, Zeal said, her eyes never leaving the wound. "Chloe, I need a bolus of heparin and tell the lab we're going to need a full cardiac panel in 10 minutes. We're bringing him back." You're committing a felony," Carlisle hissed from the periphery, his voice cracking with a mixture of terror and wounded pride. He was gripping the edge of a stainless steel table, his knuckles white, watching his kingdom crumble in the hands of a woman he had called a nobody 5 minutes ago. "I'll have you blacklisted. I'll have you in a cell by midnight." Zeal didn't even look up. If he dies because you're worried about your ego, Stephen, a cell will be the safest place for you. She executed a surgical miracle that silenced the room. With a flick of her wrist and a tension that seemed to vibrate through the very air, she anchored the failing graft against the healthy tissue, creating a seal so perfect it looked factory-made. The tear that had been pouring life onto the floor was suddenly, impossibly closed. The silence in the OR shifted. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of impending death. It was the breathless quiet of witnesses watching a legend. Hannah watched, mesmerized, as Zeal performed a complex reconstruction that wasn't even in the standard hospital textbooks, a technique rumored to be developed by a reclusive researcher who had vanished from the field years ago. "Check the pressure," Zeal whispered. Omar's voice was a ragged breath. "Rising. 60/40ths. 85/55ths. We have a rhythm, Zeal. We have a sinus rhythm." The flat line on the monitor broke. A single green spike climbed upward, followed by another, and then a steady, rhythmic pulse that echoed the relief flooding the room. The patient's heart, which had been a still, gray weight moments ago, began to thrum with the stubborn persistence of life. Zeal stepped back, her scrubs drenched in crimson, her hands finally still. She looked at the team, Hannah, Omar, and Chloe, who stood frozen, their masks unable to hide their awe. They weren't looking at a nurse anymore. They were looking at the person who had just reached into the abyss and pulled the soul back. "Close him up, Dr. Carlisle," Zeal said, her tone returning to a terrifying, professional calm as she stripped off her bloody gloves. "I believe you know how to do that much. I have a phone call to make." As she walked toward the scrub room door, the takedown was complete. She hadn't just saved a life, she had dismantled a god. The hiss of the automatic doors closing behind Zeal felt like the snapping of a trap. She stood in the scrub room, the copper tang of blood still heavy in her lungs, watching through the viewing glass as Dr. Carlisle finally moved. He didn't move toward the patient to finish the closure. He moved toward the wall-mounted intercom, his face a distorted mask of purple rage and humiliated ego. "Code Gray, or 4. Carlisle's voice screamed through the hospital's overhead system, cracking with a frantic, ugly desperation. "I need security immediately. I have an intruder, a staff assault. Get the police on the line." Inside the OR, the rhythm of the heart monitor continued its steady, miraculous beep, a rhythmic mockery of the man breaking down beside it. Hannah and Omar stood paralyzed by the table, their needles midair, caught in the crossfire of a collapsing empire. They looked at the patient, saved by a nobody, and then at their chief, who was more interested in vengeance than the gaping chest cavity in front of him. Zeal didn't run. She didn't even flinch when the heavy thud of combat boots began to echo down the sterile corridor. She calmly reached for a pack of antiseptic wipes and began to clean the flecks of crimson from her forearms, her movements methodical and chillingly detached. She had spent years avoiding this exact moment, burying her brilliance under layers of blue cotton and silence. But now that the veil was torn, the fear was gone. The doors at the end of the hall burst open. 3 security guards, their utility belts jingling with the weight of handcuffs and radios, charged toward her. At their lead was Miller, a man Zeal had shared coffee with in the break room just 2 days ago. He stopped short, his hand hovering over his holster, his eyes darting from Zeal's calm face to the frantic, gesturing figure of Carlisle behind the glass. "Nurse Coleman?" Miller asked, his voice thick with confusion. "The chief says you attacked him in the middle of a procedure?" "She shoved me," Carlisle roared, throwing the OR doors open and stumbling out into the hallway. He pointed a shaking, gloved finger at Zeal, a smear of the patient's blood marking his own brow. "She interfered with a critical surgery, she physically assaulted the lead surgeon, and she put a patient's life at risk. I want her in cuffs, Miller. I want her out of this building and in a cell before the hour is up." Zeal turned slowly to face them. She looked down at the silver handcuffs hanging from Miller's belt, then back up at Carlisle. A small, dangerous smile played at the corners of her mouth, the smile of a person who knew exactly where the bodies were buried. The patient's vitals are stable for the first time in an hour, Stephen, she said, her voice a cool breeze against his fire. If you want to talk about putting a life at risk, we can start with the failed graft you tried to hide, or we can wait for the board to review the internal video feed. There won't be a review, Carlisle spat, stepping closer until he was inches from her face, his breath smelling of stale coffee and panic. I am the board. You are a floor nurse with an attitude problem and a fast-approaching criminal record. Cuffs, Miller. Now! Miller looked at Zeal, his expression pained. Zeal, I'm sorry. If the chief is making a formal accusation of physical assault in the OR, I have to follow protocol. Please, don't make this harder. I understand, Miller, Zeal said softly. She held out her wrists, the gesture graceful and deliberate. The cold snap of the metal against her skin felt like a beginning, not an end. As the security protocol was enacted and the guards began to lead her away, Carlisle let out a jagged, triumphant laugh. He thought he was watching her walk into oblivion. He had no idea he was simply clearing the stage for the arrival of the one person who could destroy him. The hallway felt like a funeral procession, the rhythmic jingle of Miller's belt the only sound against the hum of the hospital's ventilation. Zeal walked with her head held high, the steel cuffs biting into her wrists, a stark contrast to the slumped, adrenaline-depleted figure of Dr. Carlisle trailing behind them. He was still shouting, his voice a desperate rasp as he regaled a gathering crowd of interns with a fabricated tale of Zeal's psychotic break, and his own heroic recovery of the patient. They reached the glass-walled atrium of the surgical wing, where the elevator chimed. The doors slid open to reveal a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than Carlisle's car, and he carried a leather briefcase with the insignia of the National Medical Oversight Board. Director Sterling? Carlisle's voice shifted instantly from a roar to a sycophantic whine. He stepped around the security guards, smoothing his blood-stained lab coat. Director, thank God you're here. You've arrived at a chaotic moment. We've just had a most unfortunate incident. A nurse, completely unhinged, assaulted me mid-bypass. I was just having her removed. Director Arthur Sterling didn't look at Carlisle. His eyes were locked on the woman in handcuffs. He took 2 long strides forward, ignoring the chief of surgery as if he were a piece of discarded gauze. What is the meaning of this? Sterling's voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a gravitational pull that silenced the entire lobby. He looked at Miller. Remove those restraints. Immediately. Miller hesitated, glancing at Carlisle. Sir, Dr. Carlisle filed a formal charge of assault. I don't care if he filed a Shakespearean sonnet. Sterling snapped. Do you have any idea who you are holding in custody? Carlisle let out a sharp, nervous laugh. Director, with all due respect, she's Zeal Coleman. A floor nurse. A nobody we hired 6 months ago to fill a vacancy in the OR. She is Dr. Zoraida Zeal Coleman. Sterling interrupted, his voice dropping an octave into a tone of pure, unadulterated reverence. The former head of cardiovascular innovation at Johns Hopkins. The woman who pioneered the Coleman suture, the very technique I assume was just used to save the patient you nearly killed in OR4. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that precedes a building's collapse. Hannah and Omar, who had followed the commotion into the hallway, stood frozen. Hannah's mouth drifted open as the pieces of the puzzle finally clicked into place. The miracle, reconstruction, the viper-like speed, the authority that had felt too large for a set of blue scrubs. Carlisle's face went from a triumphant red to a sickly, translucent gray. Johns Hopkins? No, that woman disappeared. She retired after that research scandal. She didn't retire, Stephen, Sterling said, stepping into Carlisle's personal space until the chief was forced to back into the glass wall. She was blacklisted by men exactly like you, men who feared her brilliance and tried to bury her when she pointed out their fatal errors. She chose to work as a nurse to stay close to the patients, away from the politics. But I've been looking for her for 2 years to head the National Board's investigation into surgical malpractice." Sterling turned back to Zeal, his expression softening into an apology. "I'm sorry it took this long to find you, Zoraida. We received the anonymous tip about the graft failures at this hospital last week. I suspect you're the one who sent it?" Zeal stood tall, her wrists finally free as Miller stepped back in shame. She rubbed the red marks on her skin, her eyes never leaving Carlisle's. The secret researcher was gone. The legend had returned. "I didn't just send a tip, Arthur," Zeal said, her voice now a resonant, commanding bell. "I have the data. And now, I have the witnesses." The shift in power was invisible to the hospital at large, but in the dim, blue-lit corridors of the administrative wing, the air hummed with the electricity of a coup. Director Sterling was occupied in the lobby, effectively pinning Carlisle under the weight of a formal board inquiry, but Zeal knew that wasn't enough. In a system built on protected legacies, a legendary name could only get you so far. She needed the bodies. The digital ghosts of the patients Carlisle had buried under layers of redacted paperwork and unforeseen complications. "The keycard won't work on the master archives after 10 p.m., Chloe whispered, her voice trembling as she led Zeal toward the heavy oak doors of the chief's administrative suite. The junior nurse looked over her shoulder, her eyes darting toward every shadow. "Carlisle has a secondary encryption on the surgical logs. He calls it privacy protection, but we all know it's where the numbers go to die. He's arrogant, Chloe, but he's predictable," Zeal said, her footsteps echoing with a renewed, rhythmic confidence. She wasn't the ghost of the ore. Tonight, she was the lead investigator of her own life. He thinks because he's the chief, no one would dare look at the delta between his initial surgical notes and the final billing records. That's where the truth is hidden. Chloe swiped her badge at the side entrance, a service door used by the night cleaning crews. The lock clicked with a metallic thud that sounded like a gunshot in the hollow hallway. They slipped inside, the room smelling of expensive leather and the stale, lingering scent of Carlisle's cologne. "I can get you into the terminal," Chloe said, her fingers flying across the keyboard of the desk in the corner. "But the alpha files, the ones from the last 2 years, are on a local hard drive. They aren't on the cloud. He's too smart for that." Zeal stood over her, watching the screen as the digital trail began to unfold. It was a landscape of deceit. For every successful bypass Carlisle claimed, there was a secondary intervention, performed by a different surgeon hours later to fix his mistakes. There were settlement payouts disguised as equipment upgrades and administrative leave, granted to families who had lost loved ones on his table. "There," Zeal pointed to a flickering icon labeled Research Archive 2024. "That's the encryption gate. He uses the same sequence for his surgical locker. Try the date of his first fellowship." Chloe typed the numbers, her breath hitching in her throat. The screen turned a deep, blood red, and then, with a soft chime, the gate vanished. A cascade of files flooded the monitor, hundreds of folders, each one a life altered or ended by a man who valued his status more than his oath. "Oh my God!" Chloe whispered, her face pale in the glow of the monitor. "He didn't just hide the errors. He blamed the nurses. He blamed Hannah. He blamed Omar. He wrote that the surgical support failed to maintain sterile fields to cover for his own sepsis rates. It's the playbook of a coward," Zeal said, her voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, high-capacity drive. "Copy everything. Every log, every redacted memo, and every settlement. We aren't just taking down a man tonight, Chloe. We're dismantling the empire that protected him." As the progress bar on the screen began to crawl toward 100%, the sound of heavy footsteps approached from the hall. The shadow of a security guard passed beneath the door, pausing for a terrifying second. Zeal placed a hand on Chloe's shoulder, a silent anchor in the dark. The digital trail was nearly complete. The secret researcher had found the evidence, but the hardest part was yet to come. getting the truth out of the building before Carlisle realized his digital vault had been cracked wide open. The heavy oak doors of the administrative suite burst open, not with a key, but with the frantic force of a man who realized his throne was being dismantled from within. Dr. Carlisle stood in the doorway, his tie loosened, his hair disheveled, and his eyes wild with the desperation of a cornered animal. He looked past the desks and centered his gaze on the glowing terminal where Zeal and Chloe stood, the digital trail, nearly drained into the small silver drive in Zeal's hand. "Step away from the console!" Carlisle screamed, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls. He didn't look like a chief of surgery anymore. He looked like a thief caught in the act. "That is hospital property. That is privileged, confidential data. Security!" He lunged forward, his hand outstretched to rip the drive from the port, but his path was suddenly, immovably blocked. Omar stepped out from the shadows of the filing cabinets, his massive frame creating an impenetrable barrier. He didn't move with aggression. He simply occupied the space with the weight of a man who had spent a decade being silenced and had finally found his voice. A moment later, Hannah stepped up beside him, her jaw set, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "The director is on his way up, Dr. Carlisle," Hannah said, her voice trembling but holding its ground. "You should probably spend these last few minutes preparing your statement, not deleting your history. Get out of my way, nurse!" Carlisle spat, trying to shove past Omar's shoulder. It was like trying to move a brick wall. "I gave you your careers. I can take them away with a single phone call. Move, or I'll have you both fired for grand larceny. You didn't give us anything, Stephen." Omar rumbled, his voice a low, vibrating bass that seemed to rattle the awards on the walls. "We gave you our labor, our silence, and our protection. We carried your mistakes until our backs broke. That ends tonight." The human wall didn't flinch as Carlisle began to lose control, his hands clawing at the air. He tried to duck under Omar's arm, but Hannah stepped into the gap, her small frame bolstered by the presence of the others. It was a silent, powerful tableau, the hierarchy of the hospital being inverted in real time. The people he had treated as surgical support, the invisible hands and quiet shadows, were now the only thing standing between him and the erasure of his crimes. Behind them, the terminal let out a soft, final chirp. "It's done," Chloe whispered, her eyes wide as she ejected the drive and handed it to Zeal. Zeal stepped around the wall of her colleagues, the drive clutched in her palm like a holy relic. She looked at Carlisle, who was now panting, his face a sickly shade of gray as he realized the distance between him and the evidence was an unbridgeable gap guarded by the very people he had stepped on to climb his ladder. "You think this makes you a hero?" Carlisle hissed, his eyes darting toward the drive. "You're destroying this hospital. You're destroying a legacy." "I'm not destroying a legacy, Stephen," Zeal said, her voice a calm, clinical edge that cut through his hysterics. "I'm performing a long overdue extraction. We're removing the rot so the rest of the body can finally heal." The sound of the elevator chiming in the hall signaled the end of the standoff. The human wall remained firm, a line of blue scrubs that refused to break even as the heavy footsteps of Director Sterling and the legal team rounded the corner. Carlisle slumped against the wall, his hands finally dropping to his sides. The silence that followed was the silence of a finished operation. The patient was saved, the evidence was secured, and the empire of corruption had finally run out of room to hide. The administrative wing was no longer a sanctuary of secrets, it had become a courtroom. When Director Sterling entered the room, flanked by two stone-faced officers and the hospital's lead counsel, the air seemed to solidify. There was no need for a lengthy explanation. The sight of Dr. Carlisle, disheveled and cowering behind a wall of the very nurses he had spent years belittling, told the story better than any deposition ever could. "Dr. Stephen Carlisle," Sterling said, his voice echoing with the finality of a gavel. "Based on the preliminary data recovered and the eyewitness testimony of this surgical team, your administrative and medical privileges are hereby revoked, effective immediately. You will be escorted from the premises pending a full criminal investigation into surgical malpractice and the falsification of medical records. The transition was swift and devoid of the dignity Carlisle had spent his life cultivating. There were no grand speeches. As the officers stepped forward, the human wall parted, not out of fear, but out of a collective, silent dismissal. Carlisle looked at Hannah, then Omar, searching for a spark of the old subservience. But he found only the cold, hard reflection of his own obsolescence. He was led away in a silence broken only by the pathetic, hollow click of his heels on the marble floor, a disgraced king stripped of a crown he never truly earned. The room breathed again. "Zoraida," Sterling said, turning to Zeal with a look of profound respect. He held out a hand, but not for a handshake. He held a small, silver pin, the caduceus of the chief of surgery, the wings of the hospital's highest medical authority. "The board met in an emergency session 10 minutes ago. We don't just need an investigator. We need a heart. We need someone who knows that the smallest tremor on a monitor matters more than the largest ego in the room. The position is yours if you'll have it." Zeal looked at the pin, the silver glinting under the fluorescent lights. For months she had hidden her light to avoid the target on her back, believing that safety lay in the shadows. But as she looked at Hannah, Omar, and Chloe, the team that had risked everything to stand beside her, she realized that true safety didn't come from hiding. It came from leading. She took the pin and fastened it to the lapel of her scrubs. It wasn't a weight, it was a wing. "I'll take the position," Zeal said, her voice steady and resonant. "On one condition. We don't just change the leadership. We change the culture. From this moment on, there are no nobodies in my oar." An hour later, the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting a golden hue over the hospital's glass facade. Zeal walked back through the double doors of the emergency room, the place where she had first started her journey as a hidden nurse. The chaos was the same. The sirens, the shouting, the frantic energy of lives hanging in the balance. But the way the staff looked at her had shifted. She walked past the nurse's station, her stride purposeful and fluid. She didn't head for the executive offices or the plush lounges of the surgical elite. Instead, she stopped at a trauma bay where a young intern was struggling to stabilize a jagged wound, his eyes wide with the same fear she had seen in so many others. Zeal stepped up beside him, her presence a calming anchor in the storm. She didn't take the tools from his hand, she guided them. "Take a breath," she whispered, her voice a low, steady hum of authority. "I'm Dr. Coleman, the new chief. And I'm going to show you exactly how we saved this life." As she worked, the silver wings on her chest caught the morning light. The ghost of the oar was gone, and in her place stood a leader who finally understood that one person standing up for what is right truly could bring down an empire of corruption, and build something beautiful in its ruins.